I barely tasted the last sip of my coffee when the so-called emergency meeting began at 6:35 in the morning. Marcus Halden, our CEO, didn't waste a second pretending this was anything other than a performance. He didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge the hour, didn't even look at the stack of safety reports I had spent half the night reviewing. He simply lifted a sheet of paper and announced my termination, with the tone of a man canceling a magazine subscription. Tatiana, anyone can do your tedious job. You're just a name on paper. The board members seated around him nodded along, each one pretending to understand why this was happening. None of them asked a question. None of them looked in my direction long enough to confront their own discomfort. They followed Marcus out of habit, the same way people follow a fire drill obediently and without thinking. I stood there, listening to my name being read off like a defective part number. 11 years of keeping this company legally operational, reduced to a line item Marcus wanted erased, as the only licensed compliance supervisor in the entire organization. I carried the credential that kept every facility, every shipment, every audit above water. But to Marcus, it was nothing more than a signature we can get from someone else. As he put it with a casual shrug that scraped across my nerves, I kept my face still, though the silence pressing against my ribs felt sharp enough to bruise. Shock held my jaw in place. Humiliation tightened my throat. Anger sat low and heavy, waiting. Marcus avoided my eyes, as if the truth might reflect back at him if he looked too closely. When they dismissed me, I walked out without giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. The hallway felt colder than usual, but my mind was burning. Only one question kept circling through my head. Do they truly understand what they've just done? Halfway toward the exit, my phone vibrated. A notification slid across the screen. State licensing notice: your license status may affect company operations. Please confirm employment status within 12 hours. I stopped walking. So the first crack had already appeared, and they had no idea what it meant. Take a second and stretch your hands out, gently. Shake off a little tension while you're here. Tell me, how did Marcus's words land with you? Did they sting as much as they did for Tatiana? And where are you listening from right now? I love seeing this community spread across so many cities. If this moment stirred something familiar in you, feel free to subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. All right, breathe in. Stay with me, because what happens next will hit even harder. It's strange how quickly a single moment can drag you backward through more than a decade of your life. As I walked out of that meeting, the anger hadn't fully surfaced yet. What I felt first was the sting, the kind that settles behind your ribs and refuses to move. 11 years as the company's licensed compliance supervisor. And somehow Marcus reduced all of it to a redundant expense. The insult echoed louder than the decision itself. I built my career around being the person who held the entire operation upright. Every audit, every inspection, every regulatory update, it all came across my desk. Without my signature, the company couldn't legally run its primary production lines. Without my oversight, every system they relied on would collapse under its own negligence. I had protected this place through storms they never even knew were coming. 3 times. State regulators arrived unannounced, demanding records and answers. 3 times. The company was on the edge of multi-million-dollar penalties. And 3 times. I stood between them and disaster. Marcus, then only a director with a shaky voice and a habit of sweating during tough conversations, hid behind me each time. I still remember him whispering, "Please fix this," while pretending to the auditors that everything was under control. Remembering that now only sharpened the pain, because while I climbed through the ranks through relentless work, Marcus climbed through charm, manipulation, and carefully curated stories. He polished numbers until they gleamed with fiction, and he funneled resources into pet projects that crashed and burned while he blamed whichever team was closest. Yet today, he stood before the board acting as though I were the liability. That same morning, a brief power flicker hit the control room, a minor glitch that happens at least once a month. Marcus immediately latched onto it, pointing to me and declaring it another sign of Tatiana's outdated process failures. No one questioned him. No one asked to see the risk assessment I had submitted 3 days earlier. An assessment Marcus ignored, because approving it would have required shutting down one of his vanity projects. By the time I reached my office, the humiliation had simmered into something heavier, an anger that didn't explode, but condensed, becoming sharper, clearer. I opened the company's internal system out of habit, intending to finalize a few compliance notes before packing my things. Instead, I froze. My name was still listed as the company's only licensed compliance supervisor. No secondary signatory, no trainee, no one with the required 10 years of experience, no one legally authorized to replace me. Something twisted in my chest, not relief, not vindication, but a realization so cold it felt like stepping into ice. They hadn't just fired me. They had gutted their own foundation with one arrogant swing. And now the clock was ticking. There's a particular clarity that arrives after the shock wears off, a strange, steady quiet that settles in exactly where the hurt used to sit. By the time I reached my desk, that quiet had already taken shape inside me. I didn't feel the urge to shout or demand explanations. I didn't want revenge, at least not in the way people imagine it. What I wanted was precision, control, and compliance with every line of policy Marcus had conveniently forgotten existed. So I opened the company portal, pulled up the separation form, and filled it out with the same care I once used to sign high-stakes audit documents, under reason. I wrote a single-sentence employment, terminated at employer's decision. No commentary, no emotion, just fact. A fact that carried far more weight than Marcus realized. Because submitting that sentence triggered an automatic clause, the company's leadership never bothered to read a clause that began the withdrawal of the only license keeping their entire operation legal. The moment I clicked submit, an automated confirmation arrived, followed by the soft ping of my inbox updating. I drafted a second message, this one addressed to the State Compliance Board. My fingers moved steadily across the keys as I typed, confirming separation. Please proceed with withdrawal. Nothing dramatic, nothing vindictive, everything lawful. That was the part I savored, the simplicity of doing everything by the book, while Marcus strutted through the office celebrating his decisive leadership. I heard snippets as I packed my things, his voice carrying down the hallway. He was already bragging to the board members about removing the obstacle to modernization. They nodded along, pleased with themselves, pleased with him, completely unaware that their newly streamlined vision no longer had a legal foundation to stand on. I walked past them without slowing, their self-satisfaction almost theatrical. Marcus even flashed a smile at me, the kind people reserve for someone who's been neatly swept aside. I returned a polite nod. If he looked closely, he might have noticed the stillness in my expression, not resignation, but control. Absolute control. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed again. I expected a routine acknowledgement from the state, maybe a formal receipt of my earlier email. Instead, the subject line froze me. Mid-step, site inspection may occur within 24 hours due to supervisor withdrawal. A surprise inspection. The one scenario Marcus feared most. The one scenario he spent years trying to avoid. The one scenario that, thanks to his own arrogance, was now guaranteed. I slipped my phone back into my bag and let the elevator doors close. No rush, no panic, no second thoughts. The process had already begun, and there was nothing more I needed to do. This part has a detail that is easy to miss. Did you catch it? By the time morning settled into its usual rhythm, I had already distanced myself from the building physically and emotionally. The quiet inside me had shifted again, turning into something steadier, sharper, almost surgical. I didn't need to orchestrate anything. I simply needed to let every ignored rule and every overlooked warning fulfill its natural consequence. When a system is built on complacency, all it takes is one missing piece for the entire structure to tip. At exactly 10 o'clock, the first message arrived. A long-standing client, asked for my signature on a safety document for an outgoing shipment. It was a routine request, the kind that used to pass through my inbox 10 times a week. But today, I answered with a single sentence that carried far more weight than its length suggested I am no longer employed there. Within minutes, the client forwarded my response to 3 different department heads inside the company. Their confusion bled through the email chain: rapid questions, half-formed explanations, and a series of increasingly frantic "please advise" messages. I could practically hear the tone shift as the thread grew longer. The panic was subtle at first, but it was there. Marcus, of course, jumped in with his trademark confidence, replying, "This is only a procedural delay. We will handle it internally," but his attempt at damage control didn't survive long. 20 minutes later, a second client emailed me, then a third. Each one needed the same thing: my authorization. And each time, my answer did not change. I am no longer employed there. Short, neutral, final. Clients aren't fools. They know when something is wrong behind closed doors. The forwarding began again, emails sent back to Marcus, to the operations team, to legal, to anyone who might explain why the only person allowed to certify their shipments was suddenly unavailable. By late morning, the first shipment was halted at the port, then the second, and by lunchtime, a third sat untouched, waiting for a signature that could no longer be provided. 3 detained shipments, 3 ticking timers, 3 cracks in the facade Marcus had painted so confidently. Still, I didn't gloat. I didn't text anyone. I didn't watch the chaos unfold on social media or message old colleagues for updates. Instead, I sat with a calm that felt almost unnatural, reviewing documents for a consulting opportunity I had been previously too loyal to consider. They wanted someone with my license, my experience, my reliability, qualities Marcus dismissed without a second thought. Around 1:30, as I was closing my laptop, my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the company's internal reporting system. I still had access to automated alerts sent to former supervisors. Another oversight no one had bothered to correct. The message was brief, but its impact was devastating: compliance risk score. Critical missing licensed supervisor. A single line. A single truth. The dominoes had begun to fall exactly as the laws of their own negligence dictated. If you think you understand, the next paragraph will change your mind by the time the internal alert labeled the company's compliance score as critical. I knew Marcus would be scrambling. The thought alone didn't make me smile. But something inside me loosened like a knot, finally recognizing that it no longer needed to hold anything together. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was merely stepping out of the space I had held for years. And the void left behind was speaking for itself. It didn't take long for the first signs of panic to surface. A former colleague messaged me privately: "Emergency meeting. Marcus is losing it." That didn't surprise me. He had always relied on bravado until reality backed him into a corner. In that meeting, Marcus reportedly paced the front of the room, demanding solutions, insisting anyone could step into my role. But licensing didn't bend to impatience or ego. You either met the state's requirements or you didn't. And not a single person in that building had the credentials to replace me. When that truth finally landed, Marcus ordered his team to contact external consultants. But the law held its ground there. Anyone stepping in as a licensed compliance supervisor had to undergo an internal review period of at least 30 days before assuming responsibility. 30 days they absolutely did not have. I imagined the moment that reality was explained to him, the tightening of his jaw, the sharp exhale, the rising volume of his frustration. My colleague's next message confirmed it. "He's swearing at everyone. Says you're doing this on purpose." That part, strangely, brought a quiet satisfaction, not because he was suffering, but because the truth was finally cornering him. I hadn't broken a single rule. I hadn't touched a single system. I had only followed the process he initiated when he fired me without understanding the consequences. His crisis was built entirely by his own shortcuts. As the chaos thickened, The board members who only hours earlier nodded at Marcus with full confidence began shifting their tone. They weren't yelling, but the questions were sharper now, more pointed, hitting the edges of his authority. One of them reportedly asked, "Marcus, did you verify this termination was compliant with state regulatory requirements?" A simple question, a devastating one, because there was no version of reality in which Marcus could answer yes. Another asked, "Why was there no succession plan? You removed the only authorized supervisor." My phone remained silent, but I could picture the scene perfectly, Marcus insisting he'd been misled. Or that he'd assumed compliance would sort itself out. Or perhaps claiming that I had withheld information. His excuses were always creative in their desperation. But the final message I received that afternoon ended any speculation. It came from someone who'd sat through the entire meeting. They pulled your old compliance reports. "Tatiana, 3 written warnings about the risk of operating with only one licensed supervisor, all addressed to Marcus, all ignored." I read the message twice, then set my phone down gently. Legal consequences were no longer theoretical. They were documented, signed, dated, undeniable, and Marcus had just discovered he lit the match himself. The first real tremor reached me through a message from a former analyst. "They're here. The state auditors just walked in." Even reading it sent a ripple through my chest, not fear for myself, but a sharpened awareness of what would unfold next. When the State Compliance Board arrives unannounced, it is never routine. It is always a sign that someone, somewhere, has pushed the limits too far. By the time I imagined the scene, I knew the atmosphere inside that building would already be shifting from anxiety to full-blown dread. The auditors didn't wait for elaborate greetings or explanations. They walked straight into the executive conference room with a confidence forged by authority and statute. The lead auditor, a woman known for her precision, opened the meeting with a single question. "Who is your current licensed supervisor?" Silence thick, heavy, undeniable, settled over the entire room. People glanced at one another, papers rustled, chairs creaked, but no one answered. And Marcus, the man who only hours earlier boasted he had everything under control, suddenly found himself pressed against the reality he had refused to acknowledge. We're transitioning," he managed to say, his voice thinner than I had ever heard it. The auditor didn't bother hiding her reaction. "Then you are operating illegally." A sentence delivered without hesitation, without emotion, without leaving room for misunderstanding. What followed happened quickly. Procedures moved like clockwork because they were designed for exactly this scenario. 2 main production lines, the same ones that required my signature, were shut down immediately. Operations staff scrambled, but protocol allowed no flexibility. You cannot run what you cannot legally certify. Within an hour, the backlog began to build. Pallets stacked in holding zones. Containers kept idle instead of advancing through inspection. Every minute cost the company money, large amounts of it, and with each passing moment, the fear traveled faster. Clients must have sensed it too. My phone lit up with calls from numbers I recognized, customers demanding updates, managers pleading for clarification, logistics coordinators asking why the system had suddenly locked them out. The company, unable to offer a coherent explanation, tried to divert blame, but uncertainty spreads faster than truth. And the truth, in this case, was devastatingly simple without a licensed supervisor. Nothing moved, but the true breaking point came near the end of the inspection. The lead auditor paused her review, looked directly at Marcus, and said, "We will be expanding our investigation into last year's contract filings." Several entries appear inconsistent with state records. Those inconsistencies were the very data adjustments Marcus had made to impress investors, numbers he thought no one would ever scrutinize. When the auditors walked out, they didn't leave calm behind. They left a room full of executives who finally understood the magnitude of their mistake, and a CEO who realized the real investigation had only just begun. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. The collapse didn't come quietly. It arrived in a cascade, one blow hitting before the last had even landed. I was finishing dinner when my phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague. They just got the official notice. A copy of the document followed. Immediate suspension of operations. 6 words capable of shutting down an entire corporation. And they did. Within minutes. Every system tied to regulatory approval locked itself down. Production queues halted. Digital access revoked. Machinery placed in forced idle mode. The automated freeze was merciless, triggered by the absence of a licensed supervisor, a safeguard built to prevent companies from cutting corners. A safeguard Marcus had confidently ignored. As the shutdown spread across departments, the panic infected every layer of leadership. Investors who were scheduled to meet with Marcus that evening abruptly canceled, pulling both their time and capital. One message I received said simply, "We are postponing until the company resolves its compliance gap." Another was harsher, "We're withdrawing entirely." Then came the clients. A major partner, the kind companies fight for years to win, terminated an $80 million contract without hesitation. Their justification was blunt: if you cannot operate legally, you cannot operate with us. The financial hit alone would have taken months to recover from, even under competent leadership. Under Marcus, it was the beginning of a financial freefall, somewhere amid the chaos. Marcus seemed to realize what everyone else had known for hours. There was no workaround, no shortcut, no emergency loophole. His voice carried through multiple second-hand accounts, each message sounding more unhinged than the last. "Call her back," he shouted. "Get her on the phone now," as if summoning me would magically reverse the consequences of his own arrogance. But I didn't answer, not the first call, not the 5th, not the 10th. I had nothing left to explain. I hadn't caused the collapse. He had. I merely stepped out of the way and watched the structure he built on denial crumble under its own weight. The night's final blow arrived just as I was putting my phone on silent. A board member, one of the few who had always treated me with decency, sent a short, panicked message: "We may be legally liable. We operated for 8 hours without a licensed supervisor after terminating you. 8 hours. 8 hours of illegal activity. 8 hours of documented violations. The company wasn't just frozen, it was exposed. And now the disaster wasn't just operational or financial, it was legal. And it was only the beginning." The morning after the suspension felt strangely weightless, for the first time in years. I woke without the tightening in my chest that came from knowing I was responsible for holding an entire company upright. Now, someone else could carry that burden, except no one actually could. And that realization brought a quiet, liberating calm I didn't expect. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table, opened my inbox, and found it full of messages from clients who had worked with me for years. They weren't contacting the company, they were contacting me. Every request was the same: they needed signatures, clarifications, compliance checks, tasks I was fully qualified to handle, but no longer as their employee. So I answered politely, professionally, and truthfully, "I can support you as an independent consultant." And to my mild amusement, they agreed without hesitation. My signatures, once buried in corporate templates, now carried a different kind of weight. This time, the authority was mine. By midday, an unexpected call came in from a major competitor, the kind of company Marcus always envied, but could never actually compete with. Their offer was generous, almost aggressively, so double my previous salary, full benefits, and a team of compliance analysts to support my work. It would have flattered me once. Now, it simply confirmed what the last 48 hours had made undeniable. I told them I appreciated the offer, but wasn't ready to commit, not out of spite, not out of ego, but because, for the first time, the choice was entirely mine. Meanwhile, reports trickled in from former colleagues about the chaos at my old workplace. Marcus had become the eye of a storm he created. The board questioned his judgment in every meeting. The auditors escalated their review. Legal counsel demanded explanations he couldn't provide. Every corner he turned revealed another consequence: Another oversight. Another reminder that the structure he claimed to control had been resting on my license, my integrity, and my years of work. His panic didn't bring me joy. Exactly. But there was satisfaction in knowing that justice didn't need theatrics. It simply needed truth. Late that afternoon, an email appeared from a global logistics conglomerate, a company so large that one partnership with them could dictate the future of any supplier. The subject line read, "Compliance Continuity Requirement." Inside. The message was short and unequivocal. "We will only continue partnership if you remain the licensed supervisor." Not the company, not Marcus. Me. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing it. They weren't requesting my return. They were making the company's fate conditional on my involvement. Without me. The deal died. Without me. The company fell even further. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just the absence of responsibility. It was the presence of leverage. And I finally had all of it. The summons arrived early the next morning, a formal request for my presence at an emergency board session, not as an employee, but as an external consultant. The distinction mattered. It meant they finally understood the magnitude of what Marcus had destroyed. It also meant they needed me now more than ever, and not a single one of them could pretend otherwise. I walked into the boardroom with calm steps, taking my place at the side of the table. Marcus was already there, pale and tight-jawed, flipping through documents he clearly didn't understand. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. His confidence, the same arrogance that once filled this room, had evaporated. The lead auditor began the meeting without ceremony. "Over the past 24 hours, she said, we've identified 12 separate compliance violations, all stemming from decisions made in the last 18 months. A heavy silence followed as she read through each violation, ignored safety assessments, unauthorized data alterations, outdated certifications left unrenewed, and risk reports left unopened. With every item she listed. Marcus shrank further into his chair. The board members, once spellbound by his confident speeches, now watched him with a growing mixture of disbelief and betrayal. When the auditor finished, she placed her folder on the table with a soft but decisive thud. "These failures," she said, "indicate a pattern of negligence at the highest level." The board turned their collective attention to Marcus. One member finally asked the question that had been circling the room since the suspension notice arrived. "You terminated the only person legally keeping this company operational." Why Marcus opened his mouth before he had an answer. She withheld information. She didn't prepare the team. She caused. But the auditor cut him off. "All documentation shows misuse." Reed submitted multiple warnings in writing. 3 separate reports indicating the risks of operating without a qualified supervisor. All addressed to you. She slid the printed emails across the table. His signature sat at the top of everyone. The room shifted. Chairs leaned back. Pens dropped. Even those who had always defended him fell silent under the weight of the undeniable. Marcus, another board member, pressed. "Did you knowingly ignore these reports?" he stammered, inventing excuses as quickly as he discarded them. "I thought legal would handle it." She exaggerated the risks. I was told compliance wasn't an issue. But every lie collided with hard evidence, time-stamped memos, forwarded risk notices, internal logs showing he'd clicked the reports and never opened them. It wasn't anger I felt watching him unravel. It was justice. Slow, methodical, overdue justice. When the board finally reached a conclusion, no one protested, not even Marcus. "We have no choice," the chairman said, voice steady. "Effective immediately, Marcus Halden is suspended from all CEO duties pending further investigation." The gavel of corporate consequence had fallen. And this time, it landed exactly where it belonged, when the board finally asked whether I'd return to stabilize operations. I answered with the calm certainty that had been building in me for days. "No, I won't be coming back." The sentence landed like a final verdict. Without a licensed supervisor, The company couldn't legally restart a single production line, not for weeks, maybe months. They knew it, I knew it, and the investors knew it too. By nightfall, every major stakeholder had withdrawn funding, leaving the company hollowed out and gasping. It didn't take long before a larger competitor acquired what remained for a fraction of its former value. I watched the news from my living room, not with bitterness, but with an unexpected sense of release. Their downfall wasn't my doing. It was the echo of every warning they ignored, every shortcut they celebrated, every decision driven by ego instead of responsibility. They authored their collapse. I merely stepped away from the final chapter. 2 days later, I accepted a position as head of compliance at a global firm that valued competence over charisma. During the call, their director said, "We've followed your work for years. You built systems others only pretended to understand." Hearing that, after everything, felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. I left my old company behind without ceremony, without regret. They had destroyed their own future long before they tried to destroy mine. On my first official day, the new firm released a public announcement. Tatiana Reed will serve as licensed supervisor for our entire regional network. And with that, the contrast became unmistakable. The place that dismissed me had crumbled under its own negligence. The place I chose lifted me higher than I had ever been allowed to rise. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply reassigns your title. I learned that walking away from a place that never valued you isn't a loss. It's an act of strength. Sometimes the door that closes is the one that frees you. How did this story make you feel? And where are you listening from tonight? If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment. Tap like. Share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Miss what comes next.